So today let's get into pentatonics, and we're going to check out a few really great exercises for building your pentatonic technique. So the first thing to understand with pentatonics are, what are the different types of pentatonic scales? And what is a pentatonic scale? There are a lot of different types of pentatonic scales, and that's something that I go really in depth on in my full Pentatonics masterclass. But today we're just going to talk about major, dominant, and minor pentatonic scales, because that's what we're going to use the most. So a pentatonic scale is a 5-note scale, as opposed to a major or melodic minor scale, or any of the modal scales that come from those modal systems, which are all scales constructed with 7 notes. So the cool thing about the pentatonic scale, by the nature of it having only 5 notes, is that soloing with it can have a more concise and, I think, edgy sound, especially when you're shifting in and out of different tonalities like I was doing in that little intro there in the beginning. And when you do that, we call it pentatonic shifting. So real quick, let's just first review the notes in the different pentatonic scales. And of course, some of you will already know this, so we're just going to buzz right through it. So here's how I like to think about these scales. A major pentatonic scale is like a major scale, except you take out the 4th and 7th scale degrees of the scale. So then you're left with just the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 6th degrees of that major scale. Therefore, from F, the notes would be F, G, A, C, D, and F. For the minor pentatonic scale, it's like a minor Dorian or Aeolian scale, which are just 2 options of minor scales that you can play coming from the major scale modal system. And if you use either one of those scales as a reference, you can just pick the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 7th notes of those scales, respectively. Gotta make sure to be respectful here, don't want to hurt the feelings of any of these modes. Okay, so essentially here we're just leaving out the 2nd and 6th notes of those minor scale options. So if we do the scale from D, the notes will be D, F, G, A, C, and D again up top. Now it's important to notice that the F major pentatonic scale and D minor pentatonic scale are exactly the same, just starting from a different note. So what does that mean? Well, that's just because, similar to the major and minor scales we just looked at, both of these scales can be sorted into a modal system. That's not super important, but it's just something that's good to be aware of. At the end of the day, you don't really want to think of the D minor pentatonic scale as being a mode of the F major pentatonic scale. You just want to know that scale on its own. So now let's check out the dominant pentatonic scale, which is also really useful. Again, we get into all the different types of pentatonic scales in my full Pentatonics masterclass, but these 3 scales are going to be the most useful for checking out what we're getting into today. So for the pentatonic dominant scale, we can look at the Mixolydian dominant scale and take the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees to make the pentatonic scale from there. So we'll be leaving out the 4th and 6th notes. So let's look at all 3 of these scale qualities, starting from D as a reference. Okay, so now getting into the good stuff. How do we use these scales? So we want to get flexible with these scales by creating patterns that create as much variation in the shapes of the melodic contour as possible. So that's just a fancy way of saying that we want to have a bunch of different ways that we can play our pentatonic lines. And the more shapes that we get under our fingers, the more we're going to be able to improvise really awesome pentatonic lines. So let's check out 3 patterns now that are going to give you a ton of variation in the shapes and even in the rhythms that you're going to internalize. These are all from my latest ebook PDF with jazz lesson videos, and that ebook is called Pentatonic Patterns for Jazz Improvisation, which has a bunch of different pattern exercises written out for you in all 12 keys. And all those patterns are applied to major, dominant, and minor tonalities. So if you want to get a download of that PDF, you can follow the link in the description of this video, which also has a coupon code that you can use. All right, so let's check out one of the exercises from this PDF to get started here. So this first shape that we're gonna check out is really cool. Notice that measure by measure, it stays pretty compact in terms of its intervallic range, which really just means it doesn't go that far measure by measure. But that creates a really intense effect because you're playing all these notes in the same part of your range. So instead of just zipping up and down your whole horn, you create a lot of intensity that can build more gradually as you move throughout the range of your instrument. So what we do here is step down a degree of the pentatonic scale. So we go from the root down to the 7th, Then we step back up and move up the pentatonic scale until we get to the 3rd degree of the scale. Once we get there, we step back down to the original note and we hop back up to the 3rd degree again. Then we start building that whole shape sequentially up from each scale degree, and that's going to sound really cool. So in other words, we use that same exact scale motion in the first measure, just starting from a different degree of the scale each measure. So check out what it sounds like when you play it throughout a couple octaves. Then when we play the exercise descending, we turn around that whole shape and play the inverse of that pattern. So every single motion of the ascending sequence, we just turn around. Instead of going down, up, and up in that first 4-note grouping, we go up, down, and so on and so forth. That's going to sound like this. So much of what I find people practice in terms of technique is just zipping up and down scales in the full range of their instrument. But that doesn't necessarily sound cool when you improvise. A pattern like this, however, has a really cool effect when you internalize this language, because it creates a lot of material in a smaller range that you can build throughout the register more gradually. And so that's going to sound really cool when you start to throw it into your solos. All right, so exercise 2 is going to do the opposite. It's going to cover a very wide range very quickly, but it's going to do it with a fascinating wide intervallic sequence. So check it out. All right, so what's going on in this shape? What we're seeing here is a jump in the middle of each 4-note grouping. So the first 4 notes, we see that the jump is in between F and B flat, coming from E flat major. If we put a G in there, we would just be playing up the major pentatonic scale. But we have that little jump in there to mix things up. So again, this is just a 4-note shape repeating, as opposed to the last exercise, which was a group of 8 notes repeating. But when we build up this 4-note shape, we're going to do something different. A lot of times when we play a pattern, we work up a shape each degree sequentially, like we did in that last exercise. So if we're playing a shape on E flat and E flat major, next we'll play that same exact shape from F, because that's the next degree of the scale. However, here we're going to skip a degree and apply the same shape to a G. So we'll be skipping past that F. But notice we'll still get to playing this shape from an F later on. So we still build each shape from each scale degree, but we spread it across 2 octaves. That makes this exercise and other exercises that use the same technique really hip. This technique was used a lot by John Coltrane throughout the 1960s. So let's check out what this exercise sounds like. Again, if you want all of these exercises written out for you in all 12 keys throughout all the major, minor, and dominant tonalities, you can check out that PDF download at jazzlessonvideos.com. The link and a coupon code for that is in the description below. All right, so for exercise 3, we're gonna mix it up and do an exercise with triplets. It sounds really cool when you can freely go back and forth between 8th note and triplet rhythms using pentatonic shapes. So it's really important to practice triplet patterns when you're building your technique and vocabulary using pentatonics. So now we're gonna have a 6th note shape. So it will be 2 groupings of triplets that repeat. You'll see this shape has a jump in the middle of the 6th note shape where it hits the peak of the melodic contour. Then it steps down until it gets to the next degree of that scale, and then it builds that same shape up and down continuously. So let's check out what that sounds like. And then when we go descending, we just turn that whole shape around, and that will sound like this. Once you get a handle of enough pentatonic patterns, you can start improvising using combinations of all these patterns naturally and with a lot of flexibility. For example, I'll just solo here using a bunch of different combinations of 8th note and triplet pentatonic patterns, tying them all together and using them all in one tonality. You can also get into pentatonic shifting, which is something that I talk a lot about in the full pentatonic masterclass that I released with jazz lesson videos. Pentatonic shifting is when you shift in and out of different tonalities using pentatonic shapes. And so that type of thing would sound like this. All right, so if you want a resource for all of these pentatonic shapes applied to different tonalities and written out for you in all 12 keys, just check out the PDF download of Pentatonic Patterns for Jazz Improvisation. And make sure to check out that full pentatonic masterclass, all of which you can find on jazzlessonvideos.com. If you want to check that out, there is a link in the description below along with the coupon code. All right, so I hope you learned something today, guys. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and leave me a comment below to let me know what you want me to cover next. Thanks for watching, as always, and I'll see you guys next time.